come from. So in the 1980s, after the internet was really starting to get rolling, a lot of people were discussing, well, what does this all mean for the world? And so there was first this concept of, well, if you could move information instantaneously anywhere between people, it's really going to change the information economy. And we're going to move from this building cities around repositories of information like palaces, libraries, universities, and everybody can just live anywhere they want and they can communicate with anybody real time. They even wrote things like the whole Earth catalog and all these other ideas. Well, a subgroup of those cypherpunks who were thinking about, well, what does this move for information? We're also thinking about, well, what does this mean for value? Money, financial transactions, these types of things. And so this group of people started coming up with ideas of how do we create a financial system that is global first, always on, digital, and behaves kind of like how the internet behaves. The problem is that that's super hard in practice because you don't want central authorities to be in power with it. So it started kind of a 30-year quest from the 1980s to about 2009 to figure out how do you do e-money or the electronic movement of value between people who don't know each other without needing a central intermediary. And that's where Bitcoin basically came from. It was the kind of the capstone of that long arc quest that the Wei Dais and the Nick Szabos and the other people like Phil Zimmerman were talking about and so forth. And Hal Finney was another actor there. It comes out, and then immediately after it came out, people started saying, well, oh, that'll never work because it has to obtain market value. You have to get a population. You have to somehow in a centralized way get a community around it. And it took about 5 years for Bitcoin to get to that point. So from 2009 to about 2014, we saw that grow. And then eventually Bitcoin got over $1 billion. And then suddenly, once that infrastructure was in place, people said, okay, this is here to stay, but we'd like to do useful, interesting things with it. So for example, maybe I'd like to issue my own currency. Maybe I'd like to connect art to something. Maybe I'd like to do land titles and deeds. Maybe I want to do water rights with it. Maybe I want to build a supply chain with this. Maybe I want to vote with this and vote online, these types of things. Okay, that's great. But the problem is that Bitcoin didn't really let you do that. So a second generation had to come, and that's really what the Ethereum revolution was about. And that was the idea of the smart contract. And once you had that, you had programmability. It's kind of like when JavaScript came to the web browser, you went from these static websites, which are pretty and they have text and pictures, to interactive websites like Amazon and Facebook and YouTube and Google and so forth. We have a two-way relationship. You can do things with them. Okay, well, once you have programmability, then suddenly you have things like decentralized finance, the DeFi revolution. You have things like NFTs that a lot of people have heard of. You have oracles, you have stable coins, all these other terms that have come out, ICOs, STOs. You have an acronym SALAD that basically comes through. So then the problem is that, well, that's awesome. It doesn't scale to the needs of millions to billions of users, and it's not really useful for a drop-in replacement for a legacy financial system. So you can't just take Ethereum and you put it into Ethiopia or Kenya or Botswana or Burundi, or put it into a local community like an indigenous population and say, okay, here you go. You can run a whole governance system with it because the operating cost is too high. The protocols don't scale like that. So then the next generation came and they really focused on that design space. That's where the Cardanos come from and the Solanas and these other things. And so this industry is now about 13 years in. We've gone from nothing to over 100 million people. And at the all-time high, there was over $2 trillion of value. There's still about 1.2 trillion in value. There's hundreds of marketplaces across the world. And it's really starting to touch on everything. It's touching on trade. It's touching on identity management. It's touching on voting, in addition to the financial stuff of just the movement of value. And even nation states now, for example, like El Salvador, has adopted Bitcoin as a national currency. So it's created a really cool global conversation of where is all of this going and how do we resolve some hard problems like governance problems, regulatory problems, and ultimately, how can these systems be used to build better marketplaces that are egalitarian at their heart? So the point of blockchain technology, the point of the cryptocurrency space is saying, well, maybe we can be that trust engine, that connecting tissue that you can then build consumer experiences, corporate experiences, and government experiences on top of that can act as that auditor, act as that immutable ledger. And things like smart contracts and all these other details are just the execution details of how do you actually accomplish that? How do you encode those types of things? For example, I know you're voting right now. How do you know that the voting system people use has high integrity? Well, in America, I would love to have the ability to know that my vote was counted. I'd love to know that my vote was counted the way I thought it was counted. And I'd like to know that the integrity of the entire election system is preserved. In other words, no more people voted than people registered, and everybody who registered was lawful to register. Very simple request. A democratic system requires our belief for this. Right now, in most modern democracies, we're told, trust us. Don't worry, we got to figure it out. You can't audit it. You can't verify it yourself. When you move to a blockchain system, you remove central institutions in the audit and oversight. What you do is you build into the system itself the self-auditing capabilities, that inclusive accountability where you can verify those types of things. So not only can you vote online, but then also you can check and verify that the vote was correct, and you can check and verify the integrity of the entire system is preserved. Turns out it's the same problem. Once you start thinking that way, then you start asking, well, what other parts of society can we do this with? Government spending. Can I track where all my money goes? Taxation collection. The trust is expensive to create, and it's very easy to lose. And when you lose it quickly. A great example, look at the health institutions. They spent many decades building up lots of trust, and then a pandemic happens, and there are some people that have lost a lot of faith in health institutions across the world, from the WHO to the CDC and so forth. So the key to building trust, I think, is ubiquitousness. So it was very difficult for people to trust cell phones and smartphones until everybody had one and started using them. And it would just become an integral component of their lives. And then and only then could you build an Uber or an Airbnb or these types of things that were connected to those facilities and services. So that's one dimension of it, is the consumerization of it and the familiarity of it. And you'll still find, though, that there are tranches of people that will never trust those systems. My grandfather still does not have a smartphone and barely uses the internet. And so, he's 90 years old. He's kind of aged out of those innovations. And that's why you need hybrid systems where you can't just fully embrace one, you need to have both. So for voting, you let people vote in paper, but you also then let people have the option to vote online. The security of a system should only rely on the secrecy of the keys, not on obscuring the protocol. You want the protocol to be publicly known, because then everybody could try to break it. And then you end up getting significantly more reliable, resilient systems. So you look at Bitcoin, for example, 13 years of history there. 100 million plus users have touched it, played with it, and everybody, including national security agencies and governments, have tried in some way to corrupt or break the system, and it stayed very resilient in that respect. So that's a certain burden of proof that will convince government actors and Fortune 500 actors to start taking it seriously. Then what ends up happening is they start vouching for it and putting their own brands and reputations on top of it. So a consumer may not trust Bitcoin or Cardano, but they might trust Microsoft or Google or Apple. And what ends up happening is when these services use that as part of their technology and white label it, you get both benefits. You get a trusted consumer brand, but then you also, on the back end, get the value of decentralization and the resilience of the system as a whole. So that's kind of where we're at. We're in the gangly teens of the cryptocurrency industry, where we've started to actually have the real global conversation. Global regulation is happening. People are working with the systems. They're building things at scale of millions of people. And we're starting to have a conversation of how do you get consumers to love it? Some never will. They'll be left out. Legacy systems are required for them, and it's moral to do that. But most will slowly move over, and they're going to move over when something of their comfort zone moves over. Maybe Facebook supports it, or maybe Gmail supports it, or maybe it's now a new icon on their cell phone or something like that. Well, the point of crypto is saying, well, we can do better. So you don't have to trust the government. You don't have to trust the local currency. You don't have to trust the local marketplaces. You have a system that can come in the absence of trust of those central institutions, build up a parallel economy, and then suddenly you can do loans now. Suddenly you can do low-cost remittances now. Suddenly you can start putting your business up on a blockchain and constrain it by the same rules that the people in the United States or other places are following. So that's why we've seen a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion, a lot of adoption, not just from locals in these jurisdictions, but for people who actually want to do good. So if you want to do direct foreign investment, and you're an NGO, you want to help out, you're an aid program, you're somebody who's there to do something, you want to make sure that it's maximally effective. So you can start saying, well, if we're going to do this, let's deploy these types of systems, because in practice, it's going to ensure that we lower the waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption and other problems that tend to come. The gold standard paid for World War II and the Apollo program and all these other things. And we had relatively constrained inflation, yet we still had a strong middle class in the United States.
Right.
And then when you look at, there was all this wealth inequality in the 19th century. No, hang on, let's be very clear about something. Throughout the course of all of human history, there was always gargantuan wealth inequality. You had kings and religious leaders and lords, and they had all the wealth, and 99.9% of everybody else was just insanely poor. And when you look at the Industrial Revolution, this was the first time that people were actually going from poor to rich. And it wasn't just a few people, there were literally millions of people doing that. Somehow then blaming the monetary system of the time for the fact that we actually had more people escaping poverty is just a bizarre misrepresentation of history. Deflationary systems, of course, bias towards people who have assets, and their assets are worth more. But the alternative is that you're creating an economy where people with political connections and insider information benefit. When you live in an inflationary economy, people who get to spend the money first and have a better ability to deal with inflation are the ones who make massive money, because they can trade their inflationary money for deflationary assets like land or other things. And so those are almost always the billionaires, the political class, and other actors. And the poor people, their wages do not scale proportionate with inflation, which is why when you see inflation go up, the people who get wiped out are the poor people, not the rich. When you live in a deflationary economy, that's a completely different thing. And usually that has really constrained understanding. It's a supply and demand mechanic. It's more of a natural market mechanic. The other thing is it prevents politicians from robbing people. It's really politically inconvenient to go and say, we're going to raise taxes. It's not really easy to get reelected when you're that guy. But if you subtly tinker with monetary policy and basically create money out of thin air, then you've achieved the same ends of raising taxes, but you don't take the political fallout of it. We have inflation that's almost double digits. When they said it was always going to be around 3% with all this inflation targeting. I mean, that's why Ben Bernanke got his job at the central bank. He was the big inflation targeting guy, and he said, we know how to target inflation. We know how to keep it under 3%. There's too much political manipulation in these things and fiscal manipulation in these things. And basically, we live in an age now of massive national debts and perpetual deficits. And the other problem is that what happens when you pay real interest rates on these things? Like if you look at a 3% interest rate on the current US national debt, that is more money in interest that you owe than the entire money we spend on the US military, $1 trillion a year. And that's just 3%. What if it's 5%? What if it's 7%? I mean, that's then more than all the tax receipts. And then the problem is you're running a deficit, so you have to print more money to be able to pay for this. So you keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's the predictable reality when a government is unconstrained and they have unlimited printing authority. And they say, well, we'll just keep the central bank somewhat independent, but you never really can. And if that's your goal, why aren't you going to crypto? Because you get true independence. No one in the world, not me, not Blockstream, anybody can go and manipulate Bitcoin. No one in the world can go and manipulate the monetary policy of Cardano and change it and say, we're just going to print 10 billion ADA out of thin air. Good luck. You can't do it. And so if your goal is monetary independence, it feels like a cryptocurrency is the way to go. Problematic to me is that the facts and circumstances will change monetary policy radically. And the problem is it's always biased towards the rich and large companies against the poor and creates more inequality. As a final point, keep it simple for people. If you think of The Simpsons, it's a show we've all seen, we all know. There's something very subtle about The Simpsons that most people miss. Homer Simpson is married to Marge. He has 3 kids. He doesn't even have a high school degree, yet somehow he makes enough money to afford a home with 4 bedrooms and 3 baths, and he lives a middle class lifestyle where his wife doesn't work. So we were in 1989 comfortable with the reality that a family of 5 could live off a single person who's not even college educated wages and live a comfortable middle class life with 2 cars. Is that the reality most families face? No, both people are college educated. They both have jobs. They can barely afford their 2 kids. They're dead up to their eyeballs, and yet they make more on paper by a factor of 5 or 6 than Homer made working at the nuclear power plant. So there's something wrong with the money.
That's it for today, guys. If you found this video useful, then don't forget to like the video and share this knowledge with your friends and family. And don't forget to check out the full video, link is in the description. Thank you.